Okay, so I started the recording and I just want to say welcome everyone and thank you for joining. Today we're going to be discussing membership journeys. My name's Debbie Lane. I'm a director and backs consultant at Moviemo. And for the discussion today, I'm delighted that I've been joined by four individuals who've worked in this space for many years and will, I'm sure, bring different and interesting perspectives to the topic. So we have today Emma Day, who is Director of Membership at the British Horse Society, one of the largest and still growing membership bodies in the UK. We have Farshad, who is Head of Digital Services at UMI. We have Lisa Goldsmith, who is a Director and Consultant at LJ Digital. And we have my colleague Gavin Lawrence, who is a Director and Backs Consultant at Moviemo. So for the next 30 or so minutes, we have four key discussion points we'd like to cover. And I'm going to start with you, if I can, Farshad. Ask you the first question, as this is very much in your area, and that is a question about digital interactions. So if I could just ask, how does web design and user interface impact member acquisition and experience?
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. It's actually a really good question. And I think it's quite timely because it does start with the first impression. When people land on a website, what is their first impression? What is your brand identity? The reality is actually there's been studies that show that people are exceptionally quick to judge websites as soon as they land on it. It's actually fractions of a second, which is quite scary. And of this judgment, it's actually based on the design. So things like the layouts, things like the colors, the content, and all sorts of things like that. And through this studying, actually, there's research to suggest that 88%, or near enough 88%, judge design and judge your credibility quite simply on what they see. So if you imagine member acquisition, people landing on a website, they're looking for trust, they're looking for credibility, they're looking for ease of use when it comes to navigations. So it leads you on to the question of, if we're imagining web design, people judging it, what is a good web design? I would say it's probably simplifying things. It's making sure people understand where they're going, helping build that trust, clear buttons to next actions, to progressive actions, you would say. And there are a number of ways to get there. But particularly in the world of membership, two areas we look at the most would be inclusive design. So this is basically a trend of designing in a way where you reach wider audiences. And by that, it's not just people, maybe with disabilities, but it's from different cultural backgrounds, different digital literacies, right? We've all seen certain people hold their smartphones or things like that a slightly different way. Inclusive design ensures that if you follow the trends, if you follow the practices, then what you're designing in simple terms basically can reach to a wider audience. And that's so important for things like conversion paths, to really ensure that you're not just reaching a set amount of people, but everyone that accesses that channel.
Can you give us an example, Farshad, of the sort of thing that you've looked at before where there's good and bad examples of that journey?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not necessarily related to world membership, but I always look at apps like Snapchat. Snapchat is very much, or even TikTok to this day, is very much tailored for maybe the younger generation, right? Things aren't exactly as clear to how to go to maybe the next page. They might rely on people knowing where to swipe or where to sort of put a certain input from their thumbs or whatever it might be. So some apps maybe consider it less because they know they have a particular target audience. You might look at websites like the BBC, completely on the other side of things. They have really good practices when it comes to inclusive design. Things are very easy to understand. How much of this particular real estate is clickable? What happens when you go to the next part of the page? It doesn't really set you up to understand, actually, that's taken me off to a completely different platform. So the way in which they build it in, they use obviously the inclusive design methodology, but really rely heavily on accessibility, which is of course a set of guidelines, more the technical standards of how you can actually achieve better usability across the website.
Okay, go on, Emma.
membership, I was going to say membership organisations often and charities often don't have the money of TikTok and Snapchat, so we're obviously often doing things in a very different way. I mean, we definitely want to make it really simple for members. I mean, in our world, age and country will give you different products, so we want to actually capture some information that only gives you the memberships that you can buy. So that's something we do to make it simple. We absolutely hate it when, you know, the date of birth, if it's not simple, you can't just type in your date of birth. That is just a real bugbear.
Well, when you get to my age and you find you're just swiping through the months for about 25 minutes, it's awful.
But I think the most important thing we've ever done at the British Horse Society is just understand where people are dropping off the journey to try and make improvements, capturing people's data who don't complete the journey. Our compliance people say we can ring them once. We ring them once, we get fantastic results of, you know, that you've left something in your basket type approach. And because we've got an insurance benefit, I think people sometimes just want to ask a few questions about it before they buy. So those have probably been some of the best things we've done.
We've also
that's a direct approach, not email. You actually call them.
Yeah.
That's really good. Interesting.
So there's also, I mean, within the world of membership, the actual membership plans and the subscriptions that are on offer sometimes aren't as clear cut as to what exactly it is. You know, sometimes there's so many different variations, and we've noticed through just research and different websites built that often having a wizard to help people guide them down into the right path. This is the right membership for you. Can reduce people going down the wrong path, you know, getting frustrated with the platforms.
And time for administrators.
Exactly, but always whether it is something that we would deem quite maybe an interface that can cause friction, might always have the option to contact us if, of course, the association always has readily available staff to help people, especially when it comes to things like membership join processes, because they can lead to some frustration.
I agree with everything that's said, and I think it's really important for organisations to keep it simple. There's a lot that we see where there's a lot of over engineering before you even put technology in place. Actually, that becomes difficult to manage. And actually, what you want is really structured and well thought out steps, and to take the learning from that so that you can improve the journeys as you go, rather than having to retrospect and take things back. So I think it's, like you say, that whole user experience a lot of the time is looked at just from a technology perspective from some organisations' angle, and actually, as you say, it's that what's it like, what's that experience, what's that telephone call like, when we think about all of these things and the accessibility, not just as in is the site accessible from a, you know, if you've got a visual impairment, it's the whole, how accessible is membership in its entirety, and what does that whole experience look like? So I think the simplest side of things is the best way to start to avoid any long-term problems.
I thought that was really interesting. When Emma said about the fact that you call people, it's we sometimes forget it doesn't have to be digital. The journey, we can use the technology and then actually switch to something else as well, and I think that's really important.
Well, if you look at even the type of content you guys would be posting on membership pages, usually people, right? It's usually quite engaging. You want prospects to actually put themselves through the eyes of those existing members. So that it completely removes the digital aspect of it anyway. It very much
and you're trying to build a community of, you know, people.
Exactly.
So it's interesting, there's quite a lot of consensus there around structure, simplicity, and the personal touch. Let me just ask the next question, which is, how do payments fit in? How do payments impact member acquisition and retention? Gavin, could I come to you for that one?
Yep. So this follows on from what we were just discussing. One of the first things that I do when we're doing consultancy work with people, and they might be talking to us about introducing a different membership approach or a different membership category or a change in frequency of collection, the first thing I would do is go and see what people are doing now. And I find it quite surprising how there are often obvious problems in the journey. So that doesn't apply to everybody. Some people are, you know, going back and checking their own sites very frequently, but clearly quite a lot of people don't do it very often. And I'm amazed at how many broken links I find, and where, I mean, a good example of this, and I know that this is something we've spoken about before, Farshad, where I went through the member journey for the Welsh Rugby Union, and I'm a massive fan of Welsh Rugby, but the journey there was just hideous. It was, I was asked the question at one point, how would you like to pay? And then when I clicked for the options, there was only one option. It was like, well, it's a completely pointless question. And it doesn't take somebody who knows anything about payments to go through that experience. You can just mystery shop yourself or get someone else to do it. So that's the first thing, is it's not about the method of payment. Sometimes it is about the journey and making it easy to find, because on the occasion that I was going through that process, I was just looking to join. I knew I wanted to join already, but I felt it was really difficult to get to where I wanted to go. I was being offered tickets for things, and also I just wanted to join. I knew that was the outcome I wanted. So making it really obvious where the join now button is, or how to navigate to the right page, is important. The other major things is just giving people a little bit of choice. And that, again, my frustration there was it was card payment only, and immediately there was a £2 surcharge. So it's like the price that was offered was never the price that I was going to pay anyway. So I think some optionality is good. There are new payment methods coming out, but we know that the two big ones, without a doubt, are cards and direct debits. Direct debits are more sticky. Cards are probably easier for one-off purchases. But I don't think you can ignore either of those payment methods, because they dominate subscriptions. It's about 96% of all subscription payments are one of those two. And cash obviously isn't an option for online journeys.
Yeah.
And I'm just the biggest fan of direct debit. I mean, our members love it because it's safe, because it's an insurance product. You can, it's making sure you're definitely insured. You're not going to forget to pay. They can spread the cost monthly. I mean, it's just so many benefits, and we love it because direct debit just gives us the strongest rates of retention for members, and it just means we've got more money to help our work with horses. So I'm just a massive fan, and we make sure it's definitely front and centre on any website, and we're selling it because it is slightly cheaper.
Do you incentivize people to choose direct debit as their payment method?
At the moment, we do a £5 off for the annual direct debit, just to give that little bit of encouragement. But lots of people still choose monthly, just so they can spread the costs, especially in economic current times.
Yeah,
that's a really interesting point, because we're having lots of conversations with clients at the moment who are perhaps on an annual membership, one payment, and they're having the debate around, do we go to monthly instalments, and what will that actually do? And I think there's two sides to that, really. There's the strategic decision around how will that impact the organisation and its cash flow, but that's often equated to, actually, if we let people pay by direct debit, they're much more likely to cancel. And also there's a lot of organisations talking about those subscription-based models, so it isn't necessarily that whole you renew once a year. And I think it's really interesting, and I think, Emma, you'll probably have a view on this, because I've worked within membership organisations where we have gone from that once a year model to rolling renewals, and giving people those options of annual, monthly instalments. And actually, from my experience, I don't necessarily see the evidence, but there's a lot of reluctance around it. And I actually think, from an accessibility perspective, to have that breadth and depth of those options for payment actually makes membership much more accessible to people that perhaps it might not be. And I mean, obviously Gavin and colleagues in the room, Farshad as well, you'll have views on that, but just
I think there's a real fear that there'll be an uplift in those mid-year dropouts, but I think if you get your numbers and you work out what's my retention rate on, what's my retention rate in different years on those things, there'll almost definitely be a business case for going to direct debit for retention reasons, almost certainly.
But what about monthly versus annual, Emma?
Yeah, at the same. I think because you'll just, the choice, giving members the choice is the most important thing. That the small uplift in mid-year dropouts can easily makes up for it in every example I've ever come across.
Yeah, I suppose there's also a question about whether or not it is a rolling subscription, or whether it's an annual subscription paid for monthly. Does everybody join or rejoin on the same date that they joined originally?
No, always it's always rolling, and so just choice in it. You join on a certain day. You can,
It's the trade-off, isn't it? Because if you have annual, then you start going into pro rata in fees. There's a lot more admin involved, and actually it's thinking about it. What's the business model? What's the strategy around it? What's the most accessible way forward? And I think, definitely that more choice. And Farshad, you'll have a view on this, and Gavin as well. I don't think it's necessarily that difficult to put those options in place. We're not talking, you know, unless you overcomplicate the processes and everything around it, actually these are accessible options to an organisation to implement as well.
Well, one thing I would say is it's worth trying to make your membership rates divisible by 12.
Yes, there is that
can make it easier.
There is that. Yeah, absolutely.
It does take some thinking, from definitely structural perspective, the semantics involved with how you put them side by side and how you show the different options and maybe some benefits to go in for one different option compared to the other.
And actually, if you think about monthly, and you might get an uplift in dropouts, but actually you can think of lots of positives as well. But not just the member being able to spread the cost, but actually, when you're upgrading people, actually you can just stop the membership and start another one immediately on the higher uplift. There's some really good reasons for thinking hard about it.
Yeah, and I think to Gavin's example, I mean, you were just with one option, right? So that was all it was. So all of a sudden now the credibility and the trust you had in that website automatically decreased, right? But giving people more options would naturally help them, and it'll feel like it's a better experience anyway, right? It's options here could mean better options in other places as well.
I find it interesting that one of the largest membership organisations that there is, and it's a voluntary thing, it's not like a professional association. So if you look at the National Trust, they promote monthly direct debit quite strongly. They definitely promote direct debit over card, but they do offer both, and I think that's really important. They'll give you a £15 gift voucher to spend in their shop if you pay by direct debit. So it's quite a low cost to them, because obviously the cost of the goods in the shop, cost value is very different to the £15 value to the customer. And also, if they're going to get you in the shop, they've double won, haven't they? Because nothing in the National Trust gift shop is particularly cheap. But the thing I liked about that is the fact that it does offer both. It clearly steers you towards direct debit. But what I found surprising is some of those memberships are only sort of 70, 80 pounds, and they still are offering monthly. And again, Emma, your memberships it's not like they're hundreds and hundreds of pounds, are they? But monthly is still important to people.
Yes, I mean, we do have coaches and riding schools, which are probably a lot more, and they do a lot of monthly direct debits. Our adult is £102 this year, and I think about 40% of the people on direct debit have chosen monthly. I think for years we offered a incentive gift. Actually, they didn't. We let them select direct debit in the first year, but at that first renewal on year one, we offered a sort of about £20 retail value gift to try and get people onto direct debit if they didn't do it in the first year.
Yeah,
and that was, we made the business case for it and got up to about 90% on direct debit before we just reviewed that, and we don't do it anymore. But we're keeping an eye on the numbers.
That constantly renewing is really important, because everything changes, the market changes, people's behaviours change all the time.
Interesting. Okay, let's just move on actually. So we talked a little bit about technology, and obviously with different memberships, when it's an online journey, then you can present those options. What else outside of technology impacts on the member experience? Emma, what do you want to kick us off with that?
That's a huge question, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, everyone talks about value. You've got to listen to what your members want. That outside in view is so important. It's all about engagement, isn't it? I mean, we're on a journey to Microsoft Dynamics, where it's all about the personalization and the automation, making those fantastic member journeys. We've kind of everything we do at the moment so manual. That's exciting, and really all we're trying to do is build a community, a great community that feel that sense of belonging and value. So you get engagement, and that means you just retain them. And let's face it, it's all about retention.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, really, where we always focused the user experience on the technology, but as we say, what is that experience? There's been lots of conversations that have come back round in the last however many years, particularly when we think about those tangible benefits. Do people still send those physical welcome packs? Do they still send those physical renewal letters? Exactly. And actually, organisations quite rightly are trying to cut costs. We think about the environment, and it's how you can still deliver that experience to those individuals in the right way, where you're not alienating certain groups of people. So, you know, when we do think about the environment and thinking about various aspects, and as I say, cost cutting, but actually we are to some extent focusing perhaps too much, and it pains me to say it as a digital and data geek, but it does pain me to say it. And, you know, even talks that I've seen recently around where we put groups of, you know, demographics into certain boxes where we say, well, they definitely want digital and they certainly want paper, and actually when the research is done, it's not even what you think it was. So I think it's all of those aspects that go around it, as you've already mentioned about the telephone calls. How are you engaging with people? Is it just a chatbot, or is it actually, you know, how personal is it? Not just around personalization, but actually that whole experience. I think that's really important as well.
What was it? Can you read the question again, Debbie? What was the?
We were asking what else outside of technology impacts on the member experience.
It's huge, isn't it? Yeah.
I know, it is a big question. It's
So
where to start, really.
That people actually is important, isn't it? And how you build your customer service teams.
And training and all that. It's absolutely critical, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a huge question, isn't it? That's a topic in itself.
But do you know what? The technology enables it all, doesn't it? Let's face it.
But it should. That's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that you've said, Farshad, before. The technology absolutely should do that. Sometimes going back to your example about the choosing a date of birth from a website, if that's designed by somebody who looked at the technology first before thinking about the user experience, then it doesn't help. It does the opposite. It puts people off. And that's exactly your role, isn't it, Farshad, is to make sure that it is designed with the user in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Reducing friction, reducing the amount of clicks. I mean, with that date of birth example itself, I think, Gavin, how many was it? 66 odd clicks just to type.
For me, it was. Yeah, it's hideous. Yeah, it might be more than that. It gets more every year.
And the problem is, it depends on which platform actually people are going to. Look at us talking about a non-technology question, and it's just gone straight into technology itself. But it really does depend across the platform. We showed an example of just one line of code in an actual contact form can change from showing a mobile's alphabet keypad to now all of a sudden the actual digital, so the numeric keypad. So all of a sudden now, just by using tools that are readily available, instead of having to click 5 different things just to start typing in your contact number, you rely on iOS, the tools that they give you to say, we know exactly what this input field is, use your suggested contact number here. Now, all of a sudden, again, I keep referring to it, but it builds trust, it builds credibility. These are conversion paths. We want to reduce the amount of people second guessing themselves, and also autocorrect and detecting issues, right? You take it almost out of their hands. It's sort of repetitive information. But again, that was very interesting because it was just one line of code that would change it from one type of keypad to the actual numeric one to reduce the friction. And, Emma, you mentioned the personalization aspect. I don't know, Debbie, if we do have a question on that.
You ask your question. Go on.
That's a topic in itself. But how far in the process are you guys with actually personalization? Because it goes so much deeper than, I mean, even we could probably sit here and talk about.
We're in testing phase.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, one of the ambitions is to get more personalized, so we know what people's interested, you know, that whole seeing what's out of perhaps an e-news of lots of information, welfare, access, safety, the charity side. There's so many different areas of the British Law Society. It's getting that learning, isn't it, about what people really want to know about us, and then delivering the right content.
Because it's often the actual technical part of personalization is probably the most straightforward part of it. It's actually the internal audit, you know, looking at the type of content you guys serve or the type of metrics you guys are trying to get to serve that personalization. That's where most of the thinking tends to happen, or actually the housekeeping. A lot of times we're getting into it, but the content migration from one CMS to another, new requirements, so people want more personalization in a new website. That's easy. We've got a few classes that can do that for you. It's what type of content do you have? How is it currently house kept? Is it in line with the personalized experience? And is personalization actually someone just clicking on something one time? or is it actually them going repetitively converting on that particular item? You don't want to push them down a particular funnel, and now all of a sudden they're missing different types of content. So there's so much that goes into just that personalization aspect. Sorry to Debbie to completely take it down a different
No, it's interesting, and that's what, you know, we're here to talk about these sorts of considerations. But another question I have actually is about developments and emerging technologies, and we're already starting to kind of talk about how we can use different technologies as tools to help on this member journey. And Lisa, have you got any insights you could share about emerging technologies that might be coming down the line?
Yeah, I think it's actually a mixture of technologies that already exist that perhaps aren't being used as well as they actually could be. And I think also there's a lot around AI at the moment. We can't get away from it. It's coming, it's happening. Organizations are already doing it. We're seeing it's a lot in things like recruitment. I think the difficulty of all of this is, and even when we talk about personalization, is that whether the technology already exists or it doesn't, or it's coming down the line, is lots of organizations do get caught up in that buzz and the art of the possibility, and it's actually about getting the foundations right for the organization and learning from that. We can go, yeah, that's great, let's automate everything, let's put all this personalization in place, but actually it's often done without really stringent strategies around how are we going to start, how are we going to learn from it, and how are we going to get better at doing it based on what we learn as part of this journey. So there is a lot out there rather than organizations. So even when we think about there's all different types of CRM platforms, there's again with web, you know, we've got the kind of all-in-one solutions, we've got separate solutions, and organizations really, you know, have quite a big job of thinking about what technologies already exist.
How do I know which ones to adopt? And
yeah. But often, you know, AI is great, automation's great, but what organizations don't necessarily think about is, well, actually, how can we simplify what we do and strip back? You don't want to automate something that's got 10 different inputs to get to an outcome just because you can automate it, should you? There's certain things where you need to think, well, actually, so yeah, it's not a hard and fast question really, but there are lots, you know, we're looking at learning management systems, communities, you know, there's a lot taking off. Organizations are thinking about diversifying their income using these technologies for things like learning. And so, yeah, I think it's such a huge, it's a really big subject and topic in itself, I think.
From a payments point of view, there's a couple of things that are definitely coming. That, in fact, one of them is already around, and I mentioned this to you the other day, Lisa. I've got a question for you actually, because you and Emma. So two major emerging payment methods that they're very, very much the buzzwords in the industry at the moment. One is variable recurring payments, which you may or may not have heard of yet. They're definitely coming. Whether they're a good thing or not, there's an argument about that. But they currently don't exist. So there's so much talk about them being the next great thing. But I remember exactly the same thing happening with something called PayM, or Pay by Mobile, about 9 years ago. And it got shelved 2 years ago because nobody was using it. So everybody was saying this is the latest, greatest. Everybody's going to be doing mobile payment through PayM. It never happened because it never got to a critical mass. And, you know, there were a few early adopters, but then they probably regretted that because they spent a lot of money on something that was never used. The other one that is definitely coming in is already being used. And in fact, I looked at the stats on this yesterday, and this is to do with sort of subscriptions or spreading payments, is the buy now, pay later option. So we went from 10% of the population using it in 2023 to 12% of the population using it in 2024. So it's definitely growing, and it's out there. I've now used it for the first time in 2024. Because it was convenient to spread the payments over a 3-month period.
The Klarna type approach.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interest free if you pay it in time. But there is an ethical sort of question here, which is there might be a benefit to the organisation, but is there a benefit to the member? Now, there is if they pay it off in time, but if they start incurring interest charges, is that a negative? And should we be offering it?
I have a... Oh, sorry, Emma. I don't know.
No, go on, carry on.
I have a limited view on this at the moment, but was working, I won't mention the name of the client, but I was working with the client last year where we had this very conversation, particularly when we think about things like learning, perhaps not for things like membership, but where we're talking about organisations that have got things like accredited qualifications that are potentially quite costly for people to do. Obviously, the organisation wants that money up front before it starts or before the course ends. But that's quite a big uptake for people depending on when they enrol. And they were looking at this very model. And actually, there's a couple of things again. It's partly the strategic and the business model around it, because actually, for the organisation, it's partly about shifting that liability because they get their money up front, and then the kind of the majority of that relationship is there with those buy now pay later lenders. But again, there's also that reputational side from the organisation about thinking, well, how will it look on the outside if we're offering Klarna? Because there's a kind of stigma attached to it. Yes,
but I think that perception may be changing a little bit as well, actually.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Of course, but it is, again, it's thinking about that accessibility side of it, because somebody that wants to take that qualification that might not be able to afford it in the way that, quite rightly, the organisation needs to be able to receive that money to run it, to do whatever you need to do. Yeah. I think it's going to grow, and I have a limited view on it at the moment, but I'm seeing those conversations starting to come into the conversations that we're having with clients, and I think it's, yeah.
It'll come. And I wanted to, now my ears pricked up, Gavin, the variable regular, what was it?
Variable recurring payments.
Tell us more.
Yeah, so the industry is, so by the end of 2025, banks will be offering the ability to use open banking to take regular payments and vary the amounts. So it's not dissimilar to the concept of direct debit, but, and this is the critical thing, it's a pushed payment rather than a pulled payment. So what that means is the organisation isn't completely in control of it, the user is. And so some people are saying, well, that's better. If you put the user in control of it, that has some negative impacts potentially for, actually getting paid by the right person on time, the right amount of money. There are some really good things about it, and I think there are certainly use cases for it. The downside is, because the responsibility is put on the payer, there's no protection with it. So what we've seen recently, and this comes back to this whole ethical thing. So there's, I noticed that Ryanair, who have an interesting relationship with their reputation and their customers, should we say, have introduced an open banking option to pay by bank. When you book a flight now, you can pay directly out of your bank account. What they don't say is that you don't get any Section 75 protection, which is where credit cards will protect you if they go bust. There's no chargebacks on pay by bank. Once the money's gone, it's gone, and it's the person who's paying's responsibility. So, and this is what I'm saying about technology is great, and I think that variable recurring payments are definitely something that could be added to the mix, but there's a lot of talk about them taking over from direct debit. I just don't see it happening because it's so trusted. It's 60 years old. We all get on with it perfectly well. So this is where I think it's just, we've got to be careful about being an early adopter.
I think it works when you've got an obligation to pay, because you can see that working in other instances, when you're paying certain bills. I would
use pay by bank for certain things. Yeah. I wouldn't use it for Ryanair, if I'm honest.
No. But
in case you don't get that flight.
Yeah.
And Farshad, that goes back to what you're saying. It's all about trust, isn't it? If I trust the organisation, I'm more likely to potentially be open.
And even as you've mentioned, Klarna, even PayPal, they have their pay-in freeze as well. And right, these are reputable brands, or they're becoming more reputable anyway, especially in Klarna's case. PayPal's been about for a while, but having those logos, again, if you think through the web design perspective, on a checkout of all things, people are looking for that trust, that security. Their brands, they probably do recognize. So being able to then check out in that instance does help. And then one thing we haven't mentioned, Gavin, is the one-click checkout process. I don't tend to see that too often on membership websites as it is right now, obviously because there are other things involved, but
I think it depends. So if the organization you're using for card payments enables you to pay through a wallet and the membership organization wants to use it, then yeah, I can make one-click payments. If they offer Google Pay and Apple Pay and those types of things, I can do it through a wallet. The nice thing is that often it'll if it's done well, and this comes back to design again, I love it when I can populate all of my name, address, and everything, and checkout all in one go.
Well, it removes that, doesn't it, completely?
Yeah, well, it can do.
Checkout, or actually just use this branded button of Apple or Google.
But the thing that's really frustrating is when I've gone through the whole process of keying all my data in, and then I'm asked to do it all again. So it comes down to the user experience. But yeah, personally, I use Google Pay all the time, and I do sort of generally trust it. And it's optionality, isn't it? I mean, if you give me the option of direct debit or Google Pay, I'll pay by direct debit. But for most things, for certain things, I might actually choose to do it through even pay by bank. I will use for certain purchases, and that's just it. We've got to give people a bit of choice.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to say this, but I think we have to stop there because we're slightly over on time. I sense that there's a lot more we could say, but perhaps that's another discussion for another day. So for now, anyway, thank you very much for all your contributions.